My name is Timofey Samsonov. I am very glad to present at this great event. I will be talking about GIS technologies in environmental sciences. In particular, the focus of my presentation is mainly on urban climate studies. Just for the beginning, let me introduce myself. I'm a cartographer, so my primary education is in cartographic science. I finished the Faculty of Geography at Lomonosov MSU. Now I mainly work in the field of geographical information science and teach some courses. About 10 years ago, Pavel Konstantinov invited me to participate in urban climate studies. And since then, I am intensively involved in this great and modern field of environmental science. Usually I work to help urban climatologists to derive the properties of urban environment. And at my today's presentation, I'll try to give a brief overview of geographical information science, its vocabulary, and some practical applications in deriving the properties of urban environment. The presentation is based on some publications which were made in collaboration with my colleagues at Lomonosov Moscow University. We will focus on geographical information science, which is a subfield of a bit wider field called geomatics, and it includes also cartography, science about visualization of spatial data, remote sensing, which allows us to obtain some information from remote satellites, and geodesy, providing the coordinate system basis for all the sciences. And geographical information science is mainly focused on computational tools that helps us to analyze spatial data and to derive some useful geographical knowledge from it. I suggest that many of you used geographical information systems. Traditionally, GIS systems were developed in cartographic idiom when you interacted with spatial data using some visualized representations, and their main purpose initially was to make some databases and to produce maps. But recently, as the open source and programming tools advanced during the recent decades, many of us are now using computation-oriented information systems, which are integrated as special data analysis libraries and commonly used programming interfaces for Python and R languages. And this facilitates the spatial analysis greatly. To understand how the GIS science works, it's very important to know its vocabulary, because many of operations and analytical instruments are based on some basic data structures and operations. So I will try to cover the main of them, which then will be used to illustrate some practical applications in environmental science. First of all, the most fundamental for GIS science is the notion of conceptual model. Conceptual models are abstractions of geographic space which help us to represent the phenomena in digital form, in the form which can be read and analyzed by computer. And discrete objects in space are conceptualized as object-oriented models. So there are some discrete entities in space with constant properties. and these entities can be modeled as separate objects in the database. Network models are used to represent specially connected features, such as features connected by transportation networks and hydrological models. And finally, geographical fields are used as concepts for especially continuous phenomena such as air temperature or land elevation. These models must be implemented as special data structures before they can be analyzed by computer. And there are some basic data structures which are used everywhere in GIS science, and they can be subdivided in some categories, such as vector data, which are usually modeled by simple features concepts. Simple features are international standardized form of representation of vector data. It's ISO standard. And it talks about objects as points, line strings, and polygons, and their multi-counterparts. And simple features are used to model discrete objects in space. When we talk about some continuous special phenomena, the coverage models are usually used, and raster and TN models are very common in this field. Network models are the direct reflections of the conceptual model, and the one specific special data model, which is very important and even more frequently used nowadays, are discrete global grid systems, which tessellate the Earth's surface on the cells of equal geometry and area. Such discrete global systems are used both for special aggregations and for modeling. For example, the well-known ICON model used such a discrete global grid system. So special models are just data structures which can be used to represent the real-world data in computer-readable form. The next important notion is spatial data transformation. Sometimes some basic structures are not effective enough for spatial analysis. For example, during the spatial interpolation, we go from discrete point observations to some discrete field represented in raster form. And this transformation is from simple feature data to raster coverage. Another commonly known transformation is estimation of spatial density, in which we calculate how densely the objects are located on the Earth's surface. Also, contouring can be seen as a spatial data model transformation, and it is commonly used for data visualization. And raster to vector and vector to raster transformations are very useful in cases when we want to use some specific methods which are not applicable to specific data model. Spatial relations are so fundamental for GIS analysis such that they are used in nearly every spatial analysis operation, and they usually subdivided into metric, topological, and directional. Metric relations are used to derive distances between objects, and depending on the coordinate system, we use planimetric distances or great circle distances. Topological relations allow us to select the data which is located in some special relation to another data. For example, if you want to select measurements inside the urban area, you can use the contains relation and select all the crowdsourced meteorological observations inside the urban area. Also, directional relations allow us to conceptualize various azimuths and directional angles in space, and they also are classified depending on the basic vector data model which is used to compute it. For example, if you have 2-point objects, you can use just a simple angle, but if you have two moving objects A and B, you want to classify the location of direction of point C in relation to these objects, you can use the projective model. So all these kinds of special relations are supplemented by computational tools. Not less important are geometric transformations, which allow us to go from one representation of phenomena to another, to derive various areas of inside which the phenomenon exists, and to go from one geometry to some derivative geometry, which can be more useful from the point of view of analysis. For example, you can use the buffer operation to extend the area of your area of interest, and to select more data in some distance which is correlated with your data. And for example, bounding geometry operations are commonly used to derive the area in which the phenomenon exists if you measured it at some points. And finally, there are attribute transformations, which are commonly used in data science. These just aggregations, classifications, and a very powerful tool which is intensively used by JS scientists, such as raster algebra, and this concept can be used to apply operations on local, focal, zonal, and global level, depending on what kind of special requests you want. Using this JS science vocabulary, it is possible to conduct numerous analyses, and they are usually combined in some production chains, where, for example, you first derive the desired geometry, then you can rasterize it or interpolate, then you perform some special selections, and selected data is aggregated over some special areas to derive the resulting characteristics. In my following part of presentation, I'll try to show some examples of using JS analysis for urban studies. The first use case is urban land cover classification from OpenStreetMap data. I suggest that some of you have used this data source previously. It is open source, a cartographic database, which is compiled mainly using by interpretation of remote sensing imagery, but some of this data is derived from GPS tracks. And usually we interact with such data using a map interface, but under the cover of the map image, there are a lot of special data, and these data provide many useful information for classification of urban environment, for deriving its land cover and geometric characteristics. And such classifications can be very useful, for example, for assessment of quality of external classifications. For example, we can talk about local climate zones, the concept which is widely used in urban climate studies, and attempt to subdivide the infinite variety of combinations of urban environment elements into some finite number of classes, such as built up, open and compact, natural areas covered by trees and water, and some special areas represented by industrial districts and bare rock. Such classifications are usually derived using space imagery, and after they are after the imagery is classified, the question is how representative are derived polygons. So if we obtained open mid-rise class for some areas, what is the actual content inside this area? How reliable are derived classes? And OpenStreetMap data can be used to verify the resulting classification. And we can use the raw OSM data represented in XML, and finally derive independent land cover classification, which can be used to verify the LCZ classes. The workflow begins with some reclassification operation. It's a kind of attribute transformation, which I talked about before. So there are numerous object classes in OpenStreetMap data, and we must reduce such a great variety of classes into a limited number of interpretable classes, which can be later used in verification of our LCZ map. So the first stage is derive some limited number of meaningful layers using queries on some attribute fields. Then we apply a series of geometric transformations, which can be used to derive a seamless land cover map without topological errors. Because in many cases, for example, buildings can be located in vegetation polygons, or stream lines can be located inside the residential areas. The tricky part of classification is to reconcile the layers. So we have two different layers. We join all the objects which are located in one layer into one object, and use this joint object to erase the holes in another layer. And this chain of GIS science tools allows us to derive topologically correct land cover map. This map is further classified in some land cover classes using a set of special queries, and finally we got something like this. Surely there is no complete coverage of the area. You can see the blank areas on this map, but in most parts of the urban area we have a lot of information about location of buildings and roads. These objects are classified manually from space imagery and can be considered to be quite reliable, and such objects can be used to verify the actual content of derived local climate zones. And this is the result of possible verification. On this plot, the y-axis is dedicated to local climate zone type, and on the x-axis we see the land cover type ratio. For example, one of the built-up classes, for example, the second class, we see that the significant part of it is covered by buildings and roads, and this verifies that this class is really characterizes some urban built-up area. And also we can take the A class, which is mainly covered by tall vegetation, and from LCZ classification we know that it's really dedicated for such class. So the inner content of each local climate zone can be characterized using the independent vector data derived from OpenStreetMap. And the combination of various sources allows us to improve the reliability of our classifications. OpenStreetMap data can be also resampled on some computational grid, which can be used further in urban climate and weather modeling. These are two simple examples when we overlaid the 500-meter grid, or 1 kilometer grid, on OpenStreetMap data and derived building surface fraction and impervious surface fraction. And without OpenStreetMap data, such estimations can be used, achieved using remote sensing imagery, but because buildings are extracted manually on OpenStreetMap data, most commonly such estimations are more accurate in case of vector data. These are also some examples of characterizing urban environment from OSM. A road ratio shows us how much fraction of the computational cell area is covered by roads, and building ratios are the same, but show how much area of each computational cell is covered by buildings. Such ratios are derived by overlaying the vector land cover map with some regular grid and extracting the objects located in each cell and computing just the ratio of their areas. Another interesting application of OpenStreetMap data for characterizing the urban environment are geometric computations. Geometry of urban canyon influences greatly the various processes which emerge in boundary layer. And one of the fundamental concepts of urban climate is urban canyon, which is the space between buildings and is formed by building walls. It has a bottom, it has the direction, and it has the aspect ratio, which is the ratio between height and the width of urban canyon. In basic understanding, the urban canyon is a quite simple concept. But the tricky part is to extract the actual body of urban canyon from spatial data. So where the canyon begins and where it ends, and what exact spatial distance should be considered urban canyon width. To conceptualize the possible method of extracting urban canyons and deriving their characteristics, then we can use the spatial tessellation using triangulation. So if we have the layer of buildings in the space, we can triangulate this layer using the TIN data structure. Then we can intersect the TIN data structure with axial lines of the streets. And then we derive such useful representation of the urban space, where we have the streets and the canyons which are associated with streets, and we have also canyons which are located inside the yards between the buildings. The power of triangulation is that it not only covers the space without any gaps, but it also allows us to estimate various geometric parameters of urban environment. For example, we can derive width of urban canyon. The picture will be something like this. So we see that where the distance between buildings is greater, the width of the canyon is also greater, and when the street is very narrow, then the canyon width is also very narrow. This characteristic is commonly used in urban climate models because the physical processes which emerge in such complex environments depend greatly on the configuration of the urban canyon. Another useful parameter which can be derived from geometric data of OpenStreetMap is sky-view factor. I think those of you who relates to urban climate studies know this parameter very well. And usually it's computed using map algebra or raster algebra. This kind of operation is usually called extended neighborhood operation. When you have some point located in urban canyon, you can sample various directions around with some discretion, with some fixed angle, and analyze the height of the obstacle, of the highest obstacle in which direction. And then you derive the angle of this obstacle and integrate it over the circle and derive the desired value of Scivy factor. It's a very useful characteristic that can be applied in many computations in urban climate studies. And it also can be seen that Scivy factor is highly correlated with canyon width. So when the width is very narrow, the Scivy factor also decreases. So you see less sky from this point, and the derivative properties of this location also influence the processes that appear at this point. This is the typical map of the Scivy factor, and another interesting characteristic of the urban environment geometry is frontal area index. It determines some kind of vertical roughness of the surface and is usually calculated for some fixed direction. So it will depend on direction from which, for example, the wind blows, and you construct the vertical surface and project the buildings on this surface and derive the area of this projection. If you relate this area to the area of the cell on which the buildings are located, then you can derive the frontal area index. It looks very interesting for when it is visualized, because it depends highly on the direction which you select. This is the example of a fragment of Moscow city. You see there the main direction of urban canyons is this, and the frontal area index is the smallest when we select this direction. So if some processes in boundary layer are directed in this direction, then the obstacles are minimal, and if they go in perpendicular directions, the obstacles maximize their influence. And we can map the values of this index in global scale. For example, if we take the southern direction of index, we can see that the frontal area index is smallest along these streets, and these streets can be characterized as ventilation corridors when such direction is or wind appears. And changing the direction of the computed frontal area index, we can see how the picture of ventilation corridors changes in space. This is an example of Moscow frontal area index classification. It is deliberately classified into 5 classes to facilitate the reading of this map. Looks very interesting, and this can be quite useful in some urban studies. To summarize my presentation, I want to say that now geographical information science traditionally provides some technical tools for analyzing spatial data, but recently, during the recent decades, the GIS science idiom shifted from cartographic to computational concepts. So more and more computational tools are now used for applying GIS science in programming environments, and these programming environments allow you to combine many libraries in your computational workflows and derive some complex analysis and databases useful for environmental applications. And one of the most commonly used databases is OpenStreetMap, and there are a lot of publications which apply this data in many environmental sciences, and in particular in my presentation I have tried to show how this data can be used to characterize the urban environment from the point of view of land cover and urban geometry.